In the mansion where every order was law, a tense silence broke the ritual. The maid, young, black, and with a firm posture, heard the millionaire's cold voice demanding more than the job required. But this time she didn't bow. Emily raised her eyes, met his gaze without trembling, and said a no that echoed like thunder. The room was plunged in astonishment. No one had ever dared refuse her anything. The millionaire, accustomed to obedient bowing,
Are you
felt
sure
his
you're quite
pride
comfortable
burn.
here?
It wasn't just a refusal. It was an affront to his own authority.
You refuse.
And it was in that moment that the power game changed forever. The silence that followed was as heavy as the marble floor of the mansion. Alexander, the billionaire, fixed his eyes on Emily with the fury of someone who had never heard a denial. But behind the anger lay something unexpected. Fascination. Her courage cracked his armor, forcing him to see what he had spent his entire life ignoring. The servants around him held their breath, waiting for an explosion. But none came. Instead, a restrained smile appeared on his lips. Emily's refusal, which could have been her undoing, became the beginning of a silent duel. What seemed like an act of resistance would pave the way for revelations that would change everyone's fate. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. Dawn at the mansion was always the same. The iron gate opened, luxury cars came and went, the immaculate garden was tended, and the hallways echoed with orders and hurried footsteps. There every detail exuded power, and every gesture of the servants bore the invisible mark of submission. Everyone knew that Alexander, the millionaire, brooked no resistance. His words were treated as decrees, and any deviation could be costly. This was how he had built not only his business but also his home, with discipline, fear, and silence. In that rigid routine, Emily emerged as a new presence, young, black, beautiful, and with a firm posture. She entered through the side door, carrying only a small suitcase and a dignity no one could take away. Her maid's uniform, short and with a neckline that revealed her youth, seemed to reduce other women to shadows. But on her, the fabric took on a different grandeur, as if further proof that nothing, not even the role assigned to her, could erase the strength in her gaze. From the first day, Alexander noticed her, not just for her beauty, though that was impossible to ignore, but for the way she moved. Emily walked unhurriedly but without submission. She followed orders but didn't bow. She did her work with a quiet dignity that commanded more attention than any golden ornament in the house. And this, for Alexander, was a challenge. He was used to having everything. He wanted to bending wills with a snap of his fingers, to conquering not by merit but by power. And now before her, he realized that nothing would be so easy. The other employees quickly noticed the tension. Some murmured in the hallways, others looked away when they saw their boss's eyes rest lingering on the young woman. Emily didn't react. Her face remained serene, as if she knew she was being watched, but refused to allow herself to be defined by anyone's gaze. For her, being there was work. It was survival. She didn't seek out closeness, she didn't seek trouble. She simply did what she had to, sustained by an inner pride no one could touch. Helena, Alexander's wife, was even quicker to notice. Beautiful and proud in her luxurious gowns, she was accustomed to being the center of attention. But her husband, who had previously made no secret of his admiration, now diverted his gaze where it shouldn't have. Emily's every gesture felt like a threat. Helena didn't need proof. The instinct that had always guided her was enough. She began to appear suddenly in the pantry and in the hallways, watching the young woman as if watching an invisible enemy. Emily felt the pressure but was undaunted. She responded with silence, with poise, with firmness. Alexander, for his part, was waging a war within himself. The man who had always prevailed through power was beginning to find himself disarmed by something he could not control. Emily refused to be bought. She would not bow. Down she would not smile to please, and this, instead of driving him away, attracted him even more. What had begun as physical interest now transformed into fascination with the invisible force she carried. The mansion was slowly transforming into a battlefield. On one side, Helena's wounded pride, seeking ways to prove she still dominated everything. On the other, Alexander, torn between the desire to assert himself and the strange admiration for someone who dared not yield. And in the center, Emily holding her ground with dignity, unaware that her mere presence was already shaking the foundations of a house built on vanity and silence. Fate, patient, was already sharpening its blades. What seemed like routine would soon become a spectacle. All it would take was one out-of-bounds order, a firm enough no for everything to begin to crumble. And that day was closer than anyone imagined. For the first few days, Alexander watched Emily silently. He felt like a hunter accustomed to anticipating his prey's every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Emily was unlike the others. Her steps didn't tremble, her hands didn't falter, and her gaze, when it met his by chance, didn't flinch or flinch. It simply remained steady, as if she didn't recognize the man so many feared to obey. For Alexander, this wasn't just a novelty, it was a silent provocation that needed to be tested. The first attempt came on a seemingly ordinary morning. As Emily set the breakfast table, Alexander approached with a practiced smile. "Put the cup next to me, not in front of me. I want it to look like someone serving me personally." Emily looked up, carefully held the china, and placed it where he asked, but showed no reaction. She didn't smile, didn't show submission. She simply complied, maintaining the air of neutrality that made him uneasy. Later in the library, he went further. He asked her to organize some books, even though he knew it wasn't her job. "Take these volumes off the top shelf one by one and line them up on the table. I want to see how they look." Emily, with effort, did as he asked. When she finished, Alexander looked at the result and murmured, "Put them back." Her eyes flashed with a flash of disbelief, but she still obeyed. Once the task was complete, she took a deep breath and said in a low but firm voice, "Sir, I hope this isn't just a game. I have other obligations." Alexander froze for a moment. He wasn't used to hearing employees question his whims, even politely. In the hallways, murmurs began to grow. The other employees sensed something was up. The boss seemed to be testing the new employee, as if searching for an invisible limit, and she, while obeying, made it clear that she wouldn't be humiliated without fighting back. Emily's silence was different. It wasn't fear. It was resistance. At the end of that week, Alexander decided to push even further. He ordered Emily to clean the main hall alone, a task that normally involved at least 3 people. She took a deep breath, walked up to him, and replied calmly, "I will, but not in the time you desire. If you want it perfect, you'll have to wait." The words pierced the air like suppressed thunder. Alexander stared at her. He couldn't decide whether to be angered by her boldness or fascinated by her courage. Helena, from the top of the stairs, watched the scene. Her eyes sparkled with jealousy and wounded pride. She didn't need to hear every word. She just needed to see. The way her husband looked at her, the way Emily held her posture before him. She understood immediately that something dangerous was brewing. That night, Alexander brooded alone in his office. He, who had always dominated by the power of his words and the weight of his fortune, now found himself facing someone who could disarm him with a simple, firm look. Emily didn't need to shout, didn't need to openly confront him. Her refusal to be molded was a greater insult than any insult. The mansion, once built on discipline and imposed silence, began to transform into the stage for something different, an invisible war. And at its center stood Emily, sustained by the same dignity that made her stronger with each unjust order. Alexander didn't know it yet, but the definitive no was already looming, and when it arrived, it would change the course of that house forever. The tension that had been woven in silence exploded on a sultry afternoon. Alexander had spent hours in his office, irritated by reports that weren't turning out as he'd hoped. When he emerged into the main hall, he found Emily arranging flowers in a crystal vase. Her simple gesture, so serene, aroused in him a mixture of fascination and a desire for control. He approached slowly, as if testing an invisible limit. "Emily, close the curtains and come here," she said quietly, but with authority. It was a command beyond her scope of work, without purpose, an order simply to prove her power. The other employees froze, pretending to be busy with their tasks, but attentive to every detail. Emily paused for a moment. The white cloth still in her hand, she took a deep breath and, instead of obeying, looked up. There was a firmness in her gaze. "Excuse me, sir, but I'm not going to do that. It's not my place, and I'm not going to abandon what I'm doing to satisfy a whim." Silence fell like a stone. The air seemed heavier, as if even the walls were waiting for the explosion. Alexander, who had never heard such a blunt refusal, felt his blood boil. His heart beat faster, not just with anger, but with something new, strange. Admiration. Her courage disarmed and infuriated him at the same time. Helena, who was descending the stairs at that exact moment, stopped halfway down. Her eyes sparkled with pleasure at the sight of the tension. Finally, a scene that could be used against the young woman. But what bothered her was the realization that Alexander hadn't reacted as expected. He didn't yell, he didn't punish, he didn't expel her. He remained silent, staring at Emily as if trying to decipher her. Emily stared back firmly. Her face showed nervousness, but there was no submissiveness. The maid, faced with the most powerful boss she had ever known, had said no. And that no rang louder than any order. The employees whispered in the hallways. She refused, and she's still there. The fact that Alexander took no immediate action only reinforced the mystery. That night, at dinner, the atmosphere still carried the weight of rejection. Helena, with a venomous smile, made a point of dropping hints loudly. Some people don't know their place. Emily served the table silently, her gaze steady. Alexander, this time, didn't allow the venom to echo alone. He put down his fork, looked up, and said, "In here everyone has a place and deserves respect." The words weren't just a defense, they were a declaration. Emily, though she didn't show it, felt her heart race. Helena, on the other hand, nearly lost control. She saw in those few words not just a gesture of authority against her, but proof that she was losing her place within her own household. Alexander, retiring to his office later, sat alone in the darkness and understood. Emily's refusal had broken something inside him. It was no longer just a game of seduction. It was a war between his pride and the quiet strength of a woman who dared not bow down. The mansion's ballroom gleamed that night. Crystal chandeliers reflected off perfectly aligned glasses, and the soft music of a string quartet filled the space like a backdrop to a silent theater. It was another of Helena's dinners, occasions where she liked to display not only her fortune, but her absolute control over everything around her. However, that night, there was an extra shadow in the hallways. Emily's refusal was still echoing among the servants and had already reached the ears of some guests. Helena, wounded in her pride, saw this as an opportunity to crush the young woman in front of everyone. Emily was called to wait on the table, her uniform, short and low-cut, contrasted with her erect, firm posture. Helena watched her like a cat watches a mouse before it pounces. With a false smile, she insisted on asking Emily to pour only her glass, ignoring the other guests. The maid calmly approached, filled her mistress's glass, and was preparing to leave when Helena deliberately spilled the wine on her dress. "Look," she said, her voice honeyed but full of venom. "Even this is too much for some people." The hall fell silent. Some guests laughed nervously, others averted their eyes. Emily, shocked, took a deep breath. There was no way to prove her mistress's intentions. She picked up a cloth and, instead of bowing, calmly handed it to Helena. "Excuse me, ma'am." Her voice was firm, almost defiant. Her mistress narrowed her eyes, disturbed that she hadn't seen any tears or pleas. Alexander watched in silence. His stomach churned. What had been merely discomfort now became indignation. Emily wasn't insolent, she was simply dignified, and the contrast between his wife's cruelty and the maid's serenity struck him like an uncomfortable mirror. Not satisfied, Helena went further. She asked Emily to read the wine list aloud in front of the guests, a task that had never been her responsibility. Emily hesitated, but held the paper firmly. Her voice rang out clearly, without a tremor. Not only did she comply, but she did. So with an elegance that drew discreet praise from one of those present, Helena smiled tightly, realizing that the attempt to ridicule her had backfired. After dinner, murmurs echoed through the hallways. She refused, and yet she remains. The mistress lost her touch. Helena pretended not to hear, but inside she burned. Emily's every gesture felt like a living challenge, and Alexander's increasingly cold gaze only reinforced the feeling that she was losing ground. That night, as he retreated to his room, Helena stared at his own reflection in the mirror. He saw not the perfect lady he used to admire, but a woman overshadowed by someone who should have been nothing more than a shadow. He tasted the bitter taste of defeat, and it was at that moment that he decided. Humiliating Emily wasn't enough. He had to eliminate her from the house. The next morning seemed to carry the weight of the previous night. The hallways, still echoing with the murmurs of dinner, were quieter than usual as, if even the walls were refusing to speak. Emily, in her impeccable uniform, went about her routine unhurriedly, but with a heavy heart. She knew she had endured yet another public humiliation, and she also knew that her intact dignity irritated Helena even more. The other employees looked at her with a mixture of respect and fear. After all, anyone who dared say no or face their boss in that house ended up crushed. And yet, Emily remained standing. Helena, however, was far from giving up. Wounded pride pulsed through her veins, and the maid's every move was seen as an affront. At breakfast, instead of starting the day in silence as usual, she decided to turn the table into a stage once again. Emily was serving coffee with steady hands when Helena raised her voice. Interesting. So far the service has been sluggish. It seems some people are more concerned with showing off than working. The words echoed through the air like a blade. Emily took a deep breath, gently placing the cup in front of Alexander. Helena expected a reaction from the young woman, perhaps tears, perhaps pent-up anger. But instead it was Alexander himself who broke the silence. "It's perfect." His voice sounded firm, deep, almost like a sentence. Helena looked up in surprise. It wasn't common for her husband to confront her in public, much less in front of the staff. Alexander put his fork down and added, "And from today on, I will not tolerate comments that disrespect anyone who works in this house." The silence was absolute. Marta, the housekeeper, looked away, hiding a faint smile. Emily stood still, trying to comprehend what she had heard. Helena, in turn, turned pale. The blow had not only been dealt in words, but in territory. For the first time, Alexander was openly disavowing her. All day long the hallways were filled with whispers. The boss defended the maid. He spoke against you. The news spread like wildfire, changing the atmosphere. Emily, even if she hadn't sought recognition, was now seen in a different light. She was no longer just a young woman silently enduring humiliation. She was someone who somehow enjoyed the protection of the owner of the house himself. Alexander, alone in his office, reflected. He wasn't sure what had driven him to take a stand, but he felt there was no turning back. Emily wasn't just a complicated attraction. She wasn't a whim. She was a presence that revealed his own cowardice until then. His dignity had become the mirror that forced him to see who he truly was. Helena, on the other hand, burned with rage. He knew he had lost a battle, but he still believed he could win the war. Deep down, he swore he would find a way to get Emily out of the mansion, no matter the cost. It was no longer enough to humiliate her. He had to destroy her. Emily, retreating to her small room that night, looked out the service wing window and took a deep breath. The San Francisco sky was overcast, but in the early morning silence, one thing was certain. Something had changed. For the first time she felt she wasn't completely alone, and that, for her, was a breath of hope. Helena could no longer hide the tension that corroded her face. Her failure to control her husband and Emily's unflappable presence were fueling a silent fury within her. In the halls of high society, whispers swirled that the lady of the house no longer held the same influence. Invitations became rarer, glances averted at events, and even the society columns began to omit her. Inside the mansion, the humiliation was even greater. Alexander intervened in moments that would previously have been her exclusive territory. Helena couldn't bear it. He decided it was time to eliminate the root of her shame. The plan was hatched in secret. One morning, she discreetly called 2 servants and said in a dry voice, "No one is entering the pantry today. I'll organize it myself." When she was alone, she opened a towel drawer and hid a very expensive necklace, a gift from Alexander on a previous birthday. She smiled in front of the mirror as if preparing a show. She already knew what she would say. Even the intonation of her voice had been rehearsed. For her, it wasn't just a lost object. It was the final test to crush the maid. That night, during another dinner with influential businessmen and politicians, Helena began her act. She stood up with a dramatic expression, placed her hand on her chest, and announced, "A valuable piece has disappeared. My favorite jewel is no longer where it should be." The room fell silent. Eyes turned to Alexander, who raised his eyebrows in surprise but said nothing. Helena seized the opportunity. "I suggest you check the staff quarters and belongings," the guests whispered. Emily, standing in the back, felt her body go cold. It wasn't long before 2 servants, intimidated by their mistress, appeared with the necklace they'd found in the pantry, the very drawer where she'd worked that afternoon. Helena smiled, with false sadness. "I'm deeply sorry, but it seems the trust in this house has been broken." Emily looked up, her tear-filled eyes unbowed. "It wasn't me. The truth comes out sooner or later." Her voice was firm, and even amid the accusation there was dignity in it. Alexander silently observed every detail. The way the necklace was misplaced, his wife's exaggerated theatrics, Emily's serenity amidst the chaos. Something didn't add up. His clenched fists on the table betrayed the internal battle between keeping up appearances or confronting the truth. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some were already suspicious. Marta, the housekeeper, remained motionless, but her eyes said she knew more than she was revealing. Helena, convinced of her victory, raised her cup and concluded, "This house cannot tolerate dishonor." But deep within her smile was the gleam of someone who didn't realize that, for the first time, her theater was about to collapse. That night's dinner was different from the start. Helena, determined to prove she still had control of the house, prepared the dining room with exaggerated pomp, flowers in every corner, glasses glistening beneath the chandeliers, soft music filling the room. It was a rehearsed spectacle to regain her image, a desperate attempt to reassert herself as the absolute mistress of the mansion. But deep down, even she knew, something had already changed, and nothing would be the same again. Emily walked steadily among the tables, carrying her tray with the calm of someone who had learned to endure stares and murmurs. Helena watched her from afar, her eyes sharp as blades. She decided to make this evening a stage for the young woman's destruction. She waited for the right moment, when all the guests were seated, to raise her voice. "It's curious how trust can be broken by the hands of those we least expect." The sentence fell like poison across the table. Guests looked at each other, alert. Helena continued, "Theatrically, one of my jewels was found where it shouldn't have been. What else could be hidden?" The murmurs grew louder. Emily, pale but firm, stood her ground. She made no desperate attempt to defend herself. She simply said, her voice clear, "I have nothing to hide. The truth speaks for itself." It was then that Alexander, who until that moment had watched in silence, stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the marble echoed through the hall, causing the string quartet to pause. For a second, all eyes turned to him. Helena smiled, expecting her husband to confirm her act, but what she heard was the opposite. "Enough." His voice rang out deep, firm, like a court sentence. "There will be no more unsubstantiated accusations in this house." The guests held their breath. Helena froze, her smile turning into a broken mask. Alexander continued, "Respect will be maintained, and I will not allow your cruelty to continue to stain this home." The hall fell silent. Some guests coughed nervously. Others averted their eyes. Marta, the housekeeper, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Emily, still standing, felt her heart race. For the first time, she wasn't alone in facing her mistress's fury. Helena, red with rage, tried to react. "Are you going to expose me in front of everyone because of a maid?" The word was spat out as an insult, but its strength was fading. Alexander didn't back down. He looked at her intently and said, "It's not about her. It's about what's right." The blow was devastating. The lady of the house, accustomed to commanding with a single phrase, was now exposed before everyone. Her authority crumbled like shattered glass. The guests murmured, already certain that the balance of power in that mansion had changed forever. Emily, not seeking victory, simply maintained her composure. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He stood there, firm, as he always had been. And that night, the young woman's silent dignity was stronger than all of Helena's masks. Helena spent hours in front of the mirror, but she no longer saw the haughty woman who once dominated the salons. Now her reflection revealed dark circles under her eyes and the weight of defeat. Whispers in social circles were already pointing to her as unbalanced, and even within the mansion, her voice no longer echoed with the same force. Wounded pride had turned into obsession. For her, there was still one way out: to destroy Emily once and for all, no matter the cost. He planned his final act like a play. He invited a select group of friends for an intimate dinner, decorated the room with fresh flowers, and ordered every detail to shine like old times. But the shine was just a facade. What he really wanted was to expose Emily in front of witnesses and force Alexander to take sides against her. That night, the atmosphere was tense from the start. Emily poured the glasses in silence, her posture impeccable, but inside she felt the weight of her mistress's eyes fixed on her. Helena bided her time. When dessert was served, he stood and raised his voice with false emotion. "Once again, a valuable object has disappeared in this house." He placed his hand on his chest theatrically. "And I fear that trust has been betrayed again." The guests glanced at each other uncomfortably. Emily stood in the middle of the room, pale. Helena pointed at the young woman and ordered them to check her belongings. Minutes later, a servant brought a small jewelry box from the maid's room. Helena smiled with satisfaction. "Here's the proof. There's no more doubt." But the performance had a flaw. Marta, the housekeeper, approached calmly, with the demeanor of someone no longer afraid. "Excuse me, madam, but I saw you enter Emily's room earlier before dinner." The silence was deafening. The guest's eyes widened and Alexander stood up immediately. "So that's it," he said, his deep voice echoing throughout the hall. "You've gone so far as to fabricate evidence to satisfy your pride." Helena tried to interrupt, but Alexander cut her off. "Enough. There will be no more room for your cruelty here." Emily, standing, didn't need to say anything. Her teary eyes, her firm posture, her very presence were proof that she hadn't been defeated. The guests, until then divided, now murmured their disapproval of Helena. The empire of appearances she had built was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Helena, her face flushed with anger and shame, tried to regain control. "Are you against me? Because of her?" But her words no longer carried weight. Alexander didn't answer. His silence was a sentence. That night marked the end of Helena's era. The woman who believed she controlled everything now found herself cast out by her own trap. Karma silently had dealt the first blow. The last was yet to come. The next day dawned gray in San Francisco, as if even the sky had decided to witness the fall of a queen without a throne. The mansion, once filled with forced laughter and harsh orders, now breathed a heavy silence. Helena remained locked in her room, but she no longer had an audience. The servants, who for years had bowed before her haughtiness, now regarded her with a distance. What had once been fear had turned to restrained contempt. The venom she had spread was finally being turned against her. Alexander spent the morning in his office, examining the notes Emily had left in his pockets over the months on his desk. Small, folded papers that had silently planted the seeds of truth. What we keep silent about condemns us. The truth always finds a way. When words fail, karma speaks. He finally understood that each of Emily's refusals, each firm silence in the face of his orders, and Helena's humiliations had been disguised screams, and he, out of cowardice, had been slow to listen to them. Late in the afternoon, Helena descended the stairs for the last time. She wore one of her red dresses, trying to maintain her poise, but her gait betrayed the weight of defeat. Alexander was waiting for her in the main hall where Marta, some servants, and even two of the friends who had witnessed the previous night's fiasco were also present. There were no elaborate speeches, just the truth, spoken with the simplicity of someone who no longer fears anything. "You've turned this house into a stage for cruelty," Alexander said, his voice firm, "and now you're going to reap what you sowed." Helena tried to react, but her voice was no longer resonating. "Are you going to throw me out of my own house because of a maid?" The word maid was spat out like venom, but no one reacted. Alexander remained silent, his hard gaze fixed on her. His silence was the final sentence. Helena left the hall under eyes that no longer wavered. The mansion gate closed behind her, not as a farewell, but as a condemnation. Emily, who remained standing in the background, neither smiled nor celebrated. Her victory wasn't over Helena nor Alexander. It was over herself. She had stood firm when everyone expected her to give in. She had carried within her a dignity that neither money nor arrogance could buy. And now, in front of everyone, that dignity spoke louder than any words. Alexander approached her, not as a boss, but as someone acknowledging a debt. "Thank you," he murmured, "for not giving in." Emily looked up, her eyes tearful but strong. "Fate exacts from each one what they deserve," she replied simply. That night, the mansion's chandeliers still shone, but there was a new light in the air. Justice silently had finally been served. Helena had departed to the solitude she had sown. Alexander had been left with the bitter lesson of his own omission, and Emily remained a symbol of courage, reminding everyone that even in silence truth finds its way. Karma is in no hurry, but when it arrives, it makes no mistakes. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Fate always takes its toll.